Good afternoon. The Commission will come to order in the matter of revisions to the Commission's regulations involving small generator facility interconnection standards in rulemaking number 68. The last time we met was about a year ago in September, where we finalized the rules with respect to Phase 1 of the interconnection standards. And Phase 2 continued that effort to modernize our grid by making it easier and more automated and transparent for distributed energy resources to connect the facility to the larger grid and to support our PC44 efforts with respect to grid modernization. Today we have a number of comments that were filed with the agency. I believe we have 6 of them, and it looks like we have a number of the parties with us today. I'm very pleased to see that for the majority of the regulations, under the leadership of our Chief Engineer, John Borkowski, who served as the work group leader, they managed to gain consensus on 51 out of the 55 proposed regulations. Apparently, with respect to the remaining 4, there are some parties with either limited or other concerns that we will discuss in due course. In order to organize today's hearing, what we'll do is, to the extent there are consensus items where parties want to speak, they will have an opportunity to speak. Otherwise, the Commission will move forward to items where consensus was not reached. In addition, I'm aware, after reading the very thorough and comprehensive work group report that was filed in July, there are some other requests from the work group regarding recommendations or seeking advice from the Commission, and we could address those issues as well today. So to begin, I will turn the floor over to our Chief Judge, and then we will proceed accordingly. Chief Judge or Engineer, yes. Can you do both? We also need an Executive Secretary. Chief Engineer.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. John Borkowski for the PC44 Interconnection Work Group. And to my right, I have Staff Counsel Mike Dean, and to my left, I have Engineer in the Engineering Division, DeAndre Wilson, and DeAndre helped me with the work group efforts. If adopted by the Commission, I believe the proposed regulations you consider today will remove obstacles and promote efficiency for interconnecting clean energy in Maryland to support achieving the goals of the Clean Energy Jobs Act. As you know, with the conclusion of the 2019 Maryland General Assembly, we have an initiative established in Senate Bill 516 to basically achieve 14.5% solar RPS by 2030 and 50% renewables by 2030. And then there's some other parts of that bill which I won't discuss. But in general, we really need to have interconnection regulations that support interconnecting clean energy to the grid. And hopefully you'll agree that this effort promotes that. Next slide. With respect to RM68, I'll just say that we've worked on a number of items since Phase 1, which we came in with RM61 last year. And I think that many of the items that we tackled in Phase 2 were really non-consensus areas that were left over from Phase 1. But we also did tackle a few new areas. For instance, interconnection jurisdiction wasn't on our radar last year, but became an issue because of a few isolated issues with projects and some confusion about interconnection jurisdiction. So we chose to tackle that. But I would like to say at the outset that I think we had a high level of engagement by the stakeholders. We have approximately 130 people on our list, and good engagement during the meetings that we had. And it resulted in a near consensus document as demonstrated in the comments that were filed on September 10th. Andre? Okay, so my approach will be just to go through the various sections. I will briefly go through where we had consensus, and maybe dwell on a few highlights.
And Chief, on areas where we've gained consensus, I know the commissioners have reviewed those points. We could probably spend less time on them,
Right.
but more time on the others, which it sounds like is what your plan is.
Exactly. Okay. I will say that in the interconnection standards, which is the first area that we'll cover, we did have consensus on these regulations. I do want to note that I had significant support from Andrew Levitt at PJM, who's here today, and as you can see from the comments that PJM filed, they do agree with what our proposals are, and I would just open it up at this point without going into detail if the commission has any questions.
Chief, just remind me as a matter of process. So on this first page, the red line, there's some strikeouts. What was the process for those strikeouts of the red line? Was that during the course of the working group's discussions and deliberations?
Right. The process, in general, we developed a number of different white papers that were discussed with the work group. Various members of the work group had interest in various topics, more engagement, if you will, but we shared the white papers with the whole team, and we sort of evolved all these white papers into the final report. So we kind of parsed everything out. So that was the process, and with regard to actually the regulations, these are, the strike-throughs represent changes to the existing regulations, and it's pretty much what we will take, if approved, what we will take from this session, and we'll work with Tanya to submit that through the AELR, as part of the regulation process. But everyone had an opportunity in the group to comment. Where we had no consensus, it was noted in the final report. But this is what you see here is pretty much a proposed regulation changes.
Okay, I was thinking it was proposed new language that was being struck, so I didn't.
No, I'm sorry.
It
Should
was,
have explained that.
okay, no problem. Thank you.
Okay, so if the slides 3 and 4 are on interconnection standards. If there are no questions, I'll say that we had a number of new definitions added starting on slide 5 and going through slide 9. Likewise, there were no dissenting comments about the definitions themselves, although the application of some of the definitions in some of the further sections, there were some dissenting comments, but the definitions themselves were pretty much endorsed by the work group. So unless there are any questions on any particular definitions, I will proceed to slide 10. Okay, likewise on slide 10, interconnection fees, we had consensus. If you recall, last year about this time, we had the RM61 rulemaking session, and in that session, the work group had proposed that all the different level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 interconnection requests be subject to tariff, but the commission decided that like to maintain zero fees for level one interconnection applications. So we weren't able to proceed with tariff-based fees for, at that time, but we went back with the work group and reconsidered tariff-based fees for levels 2 through 4. We're not recommending any interconnection application fee for level 1 per the Commission's direction last year. And we had consensus with that, and we had some comments from staff, just encouraging utilities to periodically update fees to reflect cost causation, and stating that the current fees remain in effect until new tariff filings. So unless there are any questions, I'll move on to the next slide. General requirements. Again, no stakeholder objections here. So unless there are any questions, I'll move on. Okay. So slide 12 is utility monitoring and control, and this is our first area of non-consensus. And I don't think we were trying to make major changes to the existing regulations. As you could see, it was sort of an effort to clarify some of the regulations that were put into place with RM61. There was some confusion about submission of utility monitoring and control plans in the aggregate, meaning we did not want to establish a regulation where if a utility wanted to control a generator less than 2 megawatts, that they had to come in for commission approval each time. We wanted to provide a venue for utilities to request commission approval of plans to implement utility monitoring control of some of these small generators in the aggregate, meaning for multiple facilities. And so that was put into place last year, but the language is a little bit confusing. However, in this go-around, we got into some more of the meat about what some of the utilities would like to do. In particular, when you look at the need for utility monitoring and control, these distribution networks are getting very complex. You have distribution automation schemes that really the amount of generation that is supplied on a distribution circuit impacts how these schemes operate. And you can optimize the operation of your distribution automation in particular by knowing what generation is available, and more importantly, in some cases, you can optimize it by control. So we want to give the utilities the ability to request commission approval plans. However, with IEEE standards development, all the new IEEE quote-unquote smart inverters are capable of two-way communications. And one way is having communication cards in the inverters, which is really the approach that the PHI utilities are looking at. But there are other ways of accomplishing this two-way communication, cloud-based, and then we have aggregators, for all these different small generators. And in these cases, the aggregators would be communicating with the small generator facilities, and then maybe the aggregators then, on behalf of all these small generator facilities, communicating with the utility. So there are different models out there and different communication methods. I don't think that the regulations as we propose them, I feel like they are agnostic to the type of communication method used. All they state is utility monitoring and control plan. But Sunrun does have concerns about allowing utilities to install a control card. I would just say that, the process that we've codified in these regulations, really would involve seeking commission, utility seeking commission approval to install these control cards. And Sunrun would have an ability, as other stakeholders would, when the utility went forward with a utility monitoring control plan, to provide comments on what the utility was proposing. So I don't think, in the end, while I definitely agree that with Sunrun's comments and concerns, I don't feel like the regulations as codified really, preclude cloud-based solutions to communications and things of that nature. I just think it's providing a venue for utilities to propose solutions to some of their unique problems where they might need utility monitoring and control of some of these small generators. So I'll stop at this point and ask if there are any questions, and if Sunrun is here and they want to say something, that's fine. too.
Right, thank you. If a representative from Sunrun would like to comment on its concerns, now would be the time, along with any other concerns, as Chief goes through his presentation, just stand up and approach a podium. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. My name is Nicole Cedar-Rahman, Senior Manager Public Policy for Sunrun in the Mid-Atlantic region. As reflected in our comments, we were active participants in the working group and overall very supportive of most of the proposals here. I just wanted to clarify that with respect to this issue, the change from may to shall is what really kind of triggers our concern and our comments on this section. So, we do not oppose engaging utilities on the ability to communicate and monitor distributed energy resources moving forward. But the issue of control does raise significant red flags for us. And we just believe that if this is to be approved, this language that essentially requires the submission of these plans to the commission, that perhaps we should add language that also requires preliminary stakeholder engagement on the part of utilities before they submit their proposals. The issue of control of DERs is being addressed in other jurisdictions. In the PJM footprint, there's a case pending at the Public Utilities Commission in Pennsylvania, where a utility there has submitted a pretty aggressive DER control plan. We're engaged there. So we just want to make sure that moving forward, that consumers are protected, and at the same time that utilities have the ability to communicate as much as they need to maintain reliability of the system. So that's pretty much all I just wanted to share about that. We certainly very much appreciate Mr. Burkowski's leadership of this working group, and just wanted to make sure that we lodge these concerns on the record.
Thank you, Ms. Sidaraman. Is it your understanding that interested parties would not have any input with regard to the utilities plan?
I wouldn't frame it that way. That's not what I'm saying. During a standard commission proceeding, certainly stakeholders would be able to engage there, but we would like to make sure that the community has an opportunity to engage with the utility before that happens.
And it is your belief and understanding that interested parties such as Sunrun would not have that ability to engage with the utility prior to the submission of a plan?
We would
Or not with 100% confidence?
not with 100% confidence. I'd say that's fair.
Thank you.
Ron, you're suggesting that in J1, change the shall to may. Would that solve your concern?
Actually, that would, I believe, be a solution. And then down in J4, pursuant to J3A,
could I just
I
ask?
think that would make sense.
How the shall to may change the process? Because it sounds like that's what you're concerned about, a process that would allow parties to be involved in the
That's true.
formulation of the plan.
That's a great question.
So, I mean, is it just a matter of trying to clarify the process?
What we would like to enhance the process. So we're not necessarily criticizing the current process that the commission has um, for stakeholders, but given the weight of potential utility control over distributed energy resources for consumers moving forward, we would just request that stakeholder engagement be a top priority for this issue.
Okay, and has the current process working with this, the PC44 work group?
I,
mean, is that-
yes.
Mr.
And I-
Wolkowski, would that be how such a plan would be developed, or, I mean, is there such a risk that you can see that parties would be admitted from being a participant in the formation of this plan?
I think that when it comes to a utility monitoring control plan, I think the utility would be developing its proposal, and whether they shared it with the work group or not, I really haven't given that a lot of thought. I felt like with the regulations, there was no step that we added here for any other participation other than to submit it to the commission for approval, and then the commission, if they heard it at an administrative hearing, for instance, I would provide notification by, since I'm maintaining a list of contacts through the work group, who would be advised that this would be discussed in an admin hearing. But really, there was really not something institutionalized in the work group, because one of my objectives was really to have the work group just meeting ad hoc in the future, not as a continuing monthly sort of thing where we're continuing to deliberate, because I feel like we've accomplished a lot of the objectives that were originally set out, but we have some maintenance items that we need to still continue to do. We could add that as something that, would be vetted with the stakeholders before anything comes to the commission, but it wasn't something that was given a lot of discussion at the work group.
But Chief, your position is that the process would be more streamlined and parties would have an opportunity to share any concerns at the time that it comes before the commission, rather than another step in the work group.
Right.
Thank you.
I might add, I would like to clarify also that the stakeholder process doesn't have to be within PC44 necessarily. It could be, a separate proceeding. You're certainly, commission is within its power to establish that type of process. So I just wanted to clarify that as well.
Chief, who's gonna, I'm sorry, we're still going?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, for these small generators, I'm looking at J3, where it identifies a process where the commission must first approve the monitoring and control plan. Are we envisioning a process where those plans are on an aggregate basis, so it's the company comes in one time to propose a plan for all customers, even those that come in at some point, maybe a year or two later? Or is it something that's updated regularly, or how does that plan get established?
Yeah, we had some footnoting in the report which described, and I think it might even be embedded in the definition to some extent, that this plan would involve multiple facilities, and it would also involve how the utility proposes cost recovery in the situation too. So there are a couple different aspects that we would want to see in any utility proposal, and including the applicability, because obviously you're not going to control every rooftop solar. You're probably looking at certain size generators, and certain characteristics. So, you know, those details would have to be in that utility monitoring and control plan also. The only intent here was to provide a venue to allow this to occur, and we felt like we needed to create an opportunity to allow utilities to come in and have this ability to improve and optimize, you know, their operation and distribution system.
So would thank you for that answer. Would the plans get filed before the portions of Part J2 are completed? So the company would have the published requirements and I guess a version of a standard interconnection agreement. Would they establish the plan before those two, before 2A and B are completed, or would they have A and B completed and customers reading the published requirements and signing the interconnection agreements, and then the company comes in with the plan?
Well, I think in some situations you might have existing generators that already have interconnection agreements, and in some cases it would apply to new generators. But that plan would be more or less a generic plan. You know, if utility, for instance, the plan might say, you know, for generators above 250, on feeders that have these characteristics, we would like to put utility monitoring on, you know, to facilitate more efficient distribution automation. And we would do that by a control card and an inverter. And, you know, by the way, here's how we propose to handle the cost. And that's just sort of a rough top of the head type of, you know, what I envision the utility would come in with. When it says, in answer to your specific question about 2A and 2B, I mean, it has to be consistent with all the utility standards and any requirements, whether they're doing it for installations that are already in service or prospective. And certainly they would have to document any of these requirements, update the interconnection agreements to reflect any new requirements for an existing generator. And, you know, of course, any new prospective generators that this would be applicable to, it would be incorporated in those interconnection agreements when they executed them.
Okay, thank you.
Chief, who will own the inverter if there is an inverter on a customer installed solar generating? Who will own that inverter? The customer or
The customer owns the inverter.
So how do we get over, if we adopt this, how do we get over utility sticking a card into a customer-owned inverter without the consent of the person that owns that property?
Well, I think it's just like any other requirement that we have in a tariff, you know, for customers. You know, I think, you know, when you look at, you know, customers need to meet certain requirements to get service. And this would have to eventually also probably be embodied in tariff language.
But what is the harm of gaining the consent of the person whose equipment you're about to get inside of and install a communications card, control card on? I don't want you coming in and sticking one on my water heater either, unless I give you my permission.
Well, I think that the harm is that there would be suboptimal, you know, distribution automation schemes. I mean, but that would be the harm.
I just don't know how you get over the ownership issue. I'm not letting you touch my equipment without my permission. You're not coming into my facility, my property without my permission. I think that's an issue.
But and that's part of our concern as well. We just want to make sure that pre-existing and future customers know their rights and have as much information as possible to make informed decisions on this. And that's why we want to, I don't know if we'll codify it here, but, or by your order, just make sure that we have robust stakeholder process on the utility monitoring and control issue.
Counsel for the utility,
Thank you.
Potomac Edison.
Yes, Jeffrey Trout, counsel for Potomac Edison. Commissioner O'Donnell, the distinction between your example and this situation is that a water heater doesn't generate current out into the utilities distribution system. So us putting something on the customer's water heater doesn't affect the safe operation of our electric distribution system and our ability to provide safe and reliable service to our other customers.
That's true today, Mr. Trout.
No, I understand that. So a water heater, you're absolutely right. If that is owned by the customer, controlled by the customer, we should only be able to put something on that with their consent. The generator, by its very existence and operation, has the potential to impact us, our employees, and all of our other customers. That's the jurisdictional and legal difference.
So unless I let you in my property to install your equipment inside my duly owned property, I can't be part of the renewable energy system.
There are sound policy reasons why we should be able to monitor the impact of your generator on our system.
But I think if you
Yes.
approach this without a heavy hand, but with a cooperative spirit, you'll get that control. I think.
I
But you
agree
can't
that
take away
that's the
private
goal.
property ownership rights. You can't. We can't.
I agree that a cooperative approach is the best. I just note that we have obligations imposed on us by the legislature and by the commission with respect to the safe and reliable operation of the system and the safety of everyone connected to that system that we cannot negotiate away.
With respect, that duty that the utilities have does not require a mandate absolute control over customer-sided systems. There are middle ground opportunities that we've shared in our comments that allow utilities to communicate, to have information about, in aggregate, about these systems without control. And if we're going to talk about control, then we also have to talk about, what happens when a customer system is curtailed and what compensation that customer should get in that type of situation. I mean, there are a lot of issues.
So can't we cover those issues when they come in with a control plan? I mean, we're sort of
Absolutely.
we're talking big issues here. We have no idea what kind of control. You're assuming they want total control, and we don't know what kind of control they're asking for, and the regulation as written enables any party who's interested in the utility control system to be able to come in and provide comment and opportunity to comment and all of that in a proceeding because the commission has to approve it. So I'm a little confused. I mean, we're sort of getting into issues that, I'm not sure we need to be getting into with respect to adopting a generic regulation that says if you're going to come in and ask for control, it doesn't say you have to ask for control. It says if you're going to come in and ask for control, then you need to come in and tell us what you're going to do and why you're going to do it, and people have the opportunity to come in and comment. I mean, I think that's what Mr. Borkowski started with when we first started this debate. Isn't that right, Mr. Borkowski?
Yes. Again, it was agnostic to the types of schemes and types of communication. It was just
Right. we're not saying a control card. I mean, it may be that utility proposes it. They may propose something else, something more, something less. I don't really know, but we're kind of getting down into the weeds of something that we don't even, we're kind of, to me, it sounds like you're raising issues that should be raised when a utility when it makes its plan available.
Can I
may I
give you
respond?
different, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I don't think I'm getting in the weeds. I just think that we're raising overarching concerns with this issue that we did raise during the working group, and just wanted to make sure that our perspective is understood. The issues that you're talking about can be addressed in a preliminary stakeholder process where the utility would hopefully engage with the community about its specific needs and preferences before they submit a proposal. So that's my response.
So the way I'm reading this is current COMAR regs in this section, they permit
Right.
monitoring and control. It's already adopted. And the only real big change in this section is taking away the discretion of the customer. That's the only change I see in this section. Because current regs say that the customer consents to the utility monitoring and control. And it appears to be operating fine. And that's the only thing that's operative in this section is you're taking away consumer consent and you're giving it to the utility. That's the only substantive change in this section.
Can I just ask a question? I would be concerned if that's the interpretation is correct, but the way I'm looking at this, it seems that all we're asking for is the utility, or for the utilities to present a plan, and then it would be up to the commission to accept that plan. And wouldn't that be an opportunity to again, put some of those parameters, those protections in? I'm kind of agreeing, I think, with Commissioner Herman. We may be getting a little too into the weeds at this point, when in fact I think we're trying to actually
I
have
feel
a
like
generic.
it keeps being directed at me.
What's that?
I feel like it keeps being directed at me.
I think you're bringing. I think you're bringing up a very good point. I just think at this point we want to get the generic rule out there. I kind of like personally the fact that we're giving it a shall, so that we will see something. In fact, I am gonna ask, why not even put a date there so that we can have I think as you brought up earlier, we're doing this because we're going to have to, significantly scale up the introduction of distributed energy resources into our system.
Right.
And if we do that, we're going to need to probably give the utilities some measure of control to make sure that we have stability in our system. So, am I interpreting this correctly? We're really just trying to put a generic plan together so that the utilities, hopefully, and I would ask the utilities to work with stakeholders, that we have such a plan that we, in short order, can consider as a commission. Is that what we're looking at doing with this?
Yes, I agree with everything that you stated, except with one caution about not every utility is in the same place to be able to require a utility monitoring control plan. Some utilities, we have smaller utilities don't even have distribution automation, so.
Well, that seems to be an issue in some of the other areas. I mean, maybe we
Right.
can differentiate the larger utilities and then perhaps the co-ops and the municipalities.
And there is one other important point here, and I apologize for sometimes it's hard to think on your feet, but we do require
On the weeds.
customer consent here, Commissioner O'Donnell, on 3B.
It says pursuant to J3A, not A
Well,
and B.
Yeah, pursuant to J3A, meaning the, and then in 3B, the utility, the interconnection customer has to consent to utility monitoring control. So,
At the risk of getting down in the weeds again, I think you're taking away consent from the consumer. I don't think we can do that. We're giving it to the utility. Do so, Mr. Trout got up and argued just that.
Well, Commissioner O'Donnell, the reason I got up and argued was because I understood you to be saying that the only way we could have any monitoring or control would be with the consent of the customer. That's not the regulation that exists now. The regulation that exists now and the regulation as revised would still have two paths to control and monitoring with respect to a customer whose facility is 2 megawatts or less, which is all the customer-owned solar and the like.
I'm gonna quit arguing this point. I'm just not gonna support this particular point. I'll probably be overruled at the risk of being down in the weeds.
At this point,
I had a question
Yes.
for Sunrun.
yes,
Um, Under the existing regulation, the only time that a utility company may file a control plan for the commission's review is if the commission requires it of them. So, is that, in your opinion, is that a better approach than the approach where the company is required to provide a plan? Everything else here, in terms of the opportunity for a customer to agree to the card monitoring and everything else, is already there. So it's really just a question of
Yeah.
whether the commission directs the utility to file or whether utility is required to file under the regulation.
I would concur that that would be our preferred outcome. That this should be a process and determination driven by the commission.
Well,
We understand the variety of stakeholders here who are really pushing for utilities to on their own submit these control plans. But our concern really is just about proposals being submitted without enough industry, community, consumer input, and so that's why I'm here today. And
no, I appreciate that, the concern. I guess the piece I'm having a hard time following is if under the current process there isn't anything here that would prohibit the utility from having a plan, because they can still get the customer's permission to monitor. They could still have the information on the website and all of the other things, but never file a plan with the commission for a review unless the commission requests it. So, I mean, they could have a plan today and we wouldn't know because we didn't ask. So I'm wondering how is it different now, or how is this not a structure that would be more favorable for Sunrun if we're directing the utility to file if they plan on controlling?
so I do represent Sunrun, but I also represent Sunrun's consumers, and commissions across this country represent consumers. And so I understand that it's a great point that you just made, that a utility might have a fantastic plan for, cloud-based communications, not even involving a control card, and you might not know about it. That's a valid point. But with this issue that really would impact consumers and the deployment of distributed energy resources writ large, and the state has a strong commitment to that, we just believe that should be driven by the agencies and entities representing the consumers, who are really the ones driving these changes.
All right, thank you.
at the risk of getting stuck on what we have, slide 12 of 50-something slides, I'm going to ask that we expedite some items with respect to consensus, and then spend more time on areas like this. Let me drill down, and then perhaps we should take a vote on the non-consensus items for clarity for our purposes here before we conclude later today with a more global motion. This section, J4, is it surplusage, as Commissioner Herman was saying in an earlier proceeding today? Does not 3A sufficiently accomplish what we need without the need for 4?
I believe so.
Thank you, Mr.
Yeah, I agree, Mr. Chairman. When Commissioner O'Donnell started talking about it, I think it actually is potentially, to me, I think it adds confusion as opposed to clarity, that section.
It reads as very duplicative as to J3A
Yeah.
because J4 refers to J3A, and both regs require approval from the commission. Does any party, would any party in this room object to, and my colleagues as well, the removal of J4?
No objection.
Just so I understand, would it be still directing the utilities to submit a plan? Because how it reads now is it would require a plan.
Right.
This seems to be rather passive.
Well, if you don't have consent, Commissioner Richard, I think it says if you don't have consent, then you have to file a plan and get it approved. That's how I read it,
Okay,
which is what the current regulation says, which I think is, I'm not troubled with, so I would support the chairman's request or
utility,
change.
any utility shall be.
So, I don't know if are we deliberating, are we?
We are deliberating
Okay, we're doing, okay.
on this item, number 4, the need for 4.
Okay, so if the interest, and certainly the chief can correct me if I'm wrong, but if the interest is in trying to make sure that as we move forward with the increased RPS goals, that we have a more comprehensive approach, then I would agree with Commissioner Richard that the more passive language in 3A isn't going to help us get there, because we kind of be in the same situation where a utility company can have consent from the customer, can have a plan in place, and because there's 3A has an or at the end, so I think it's the or that creates that situation. So basically, you can skip A and jump right to B, and the plan will never get filed because the customer has consented to it. And so the plan is now being driven by the utility company's approach or concerns or whatever it is that is driving the plan development. So I guess if we're striking 4 or proposing strike 4, then but we still want to have the plan presented to the commission, you'd have to do something with the or at the end of 3A.
At the risk of making it even more confusing, 3A is in the aggregate and 3B applies to the individual consumer. I think that's the difference between A and B. Such facilities in the aggregate, or that's the way I read that.
Thank you for noting that, Commissioner Linton. I'm still trying to digest the significance of the word or, but I see it does have an effect. So perhaps I withdraw my request and retain the surplusage because it puts a sharper point on the issue, although Commissioner O'Donnell's concern is not addressed in that respect.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's a surplusage just because it is actually.
It is different.
It's a directing an action, whereas the other is a rather passive kind of, it could happen or it could happen. And I think number 4, it gives it an opportunity. I would suggest to Sunrun to make it a very public event and make it a very transparent event, that there's going to be this plan developed and that there will be a process at the Public Service Commission for, at a minimum, through the commission to participate and to provide comment to that plan. So I like, that's what I like about number 4 right now, with
So-
shall.
Yeah. Mr. Dean, can I ask you a question? Does does J4 take effect absent 3A? Or is J4 more descriptive of 3A?
Could you say the first part of that again?
Sure. I have 3A that says the commission has to approve a monitoring and control plan, right? Or get consent. Let's say we don't have customer consent, so we'll take out the or part, right? In this particular situation. So then then you have 4 that says pursuant to 3A, the utility shall submit a plan. So does 4, I'm just trying to understand, is 4 describing what happens in 3A, or is 4 something different than 3A? And I'd be happy to, Mr. Trout, or I see Mr. who's back there. Some other folks. If anybody else wants to comment, I'm really trying to understand, because I think Commissioner O'Donnell's raised a valid point. How do these things work together, or are they different filings?
Well, under 3, if the interconnection customer consents,
Yeah, I'm not talking about consent. All right, we're out of consent. Consent, we don't have consent, so that one's out the door. So in this
well,
hypothetical,
without consent, they're very close to being the same.
Are they identical?
are they identical? That's what Mr.
Well-
Mr. Seeger. Does anybody have, you tell me, Mr. Dean. That's what I'm trying to understand.
Well, if there was consent, since that's an or there, 4 would be different then.
Mr. Trout.
Commissioner, 4 exists in the current version of the regulations. The operative change that's being proposed in 4 is changing that the commission may require a utility to submit to, a utility shall submit, period. Whether the commission issues a request for it or not, utilities are going to come forward, each utility is going to come forward with their plan. That's the operative change.
But it says pursuant to J3A.
Right.
So that's what I'm confused about, because if J3A operates in the event that you don't have consent, so that's what I'm trying to understand, why it says pursuant to J3A. I'm just trying to understand the regulation and clear up the confusion that I think is being teased out here. And
At the risk of trying to summarize discussions that were fairly broad-ranging, I think when people were making this change to 4, they were focused on the may versus shall issue, as opposed to whether how much of an intersection there was with 3A. I would propose that you could have a scenario where the only monitoring and control was with the consent of the individual customers. In that case, under the existing regulation, if a utility was in that place, they would never have to submit a plan to the commission unless the commission affirmatively asked. A plan that would cover the situation if they ever that would apply if they ever ran into a customer that didn't consent.
right.
Whereas with the change that is being proposed, whether or not a utility ever runs into that situation and whether or not the commission ever makes a request, the utility shall propose a plan that would apply if they ever had to operate without a customer's consent. That is how I read the change in the regulatory language to work. I will then go on to note that Potomac Edison, as one utility, was fine with the regulations as they were written originally. We are fine with the proposed changes that staff has presented to you here today, the redlining, and we would also have been fine, as I indicated before, with the chairman's proposal, which has since, I think, been retracted. If you wanted to drop J4 altogether, we would be fine with that too. Because our goal is going to be to operate in each case with the customer's consent, but if we didn't have that, we would need a plan, and this makes it, and we couldn't implement such a plan under either the existing or the modified 3A without your approval. I think the only thing that's getting changed here is that we would need at some specified point in the future to put in front of you a plan whether we thought we were going to need to rely on it or not.
Okay, thank you.
I think you raise a good point, Mr. Trout. Obviously, if the commission's going to approve a plan, it shall be submitted for the commission in order to approve it. I think it clears things up a bit by just striking 4 entirely, which was my original proposal. I see, even with the or that Commissioner Linton mentioned, I see no difference whether 4 remains or goes. So I would suggest striking J4.
I think we're,
So what makes what directs then utilities to submit this plan without the shall?
3A requires commission approval of the plan. In order to approve a plan, we'll have to have something to,
Well, what's going to, I guess, compel the utility to submit the plan?
The first time we have a customer that doesn't consent.
right, if 3B is not operative, if the utility has a customer that's not going to provide the consent, then the utility will exercise 3A and
Well-
provide us with the plan.
and so I guess to that point, and Mr. Trout, since you're there, I could ask you, any other company I could certainly answer as well, but for those just small generators that are under 2 megawatts, are the companies negotiating those interconnection agreements individually, or is there just a standard form that customers are provide? I suspect, and I'm answering my own question for you, but I suspect that the answer is that it's a standard interconnection agreement that would include the authorization for the utility company to control, for the very safety reasons you mentioned earlier, whether or not the company actually uses it or invokes it, but that the language would incorporate at least the ability to do it. And, whether it happens or not is another question. So I suspect that it's standard language. Am I incorrect with that? Or?
I share your suspicion.
Okay. Thank you. So I guess the point that I was making earlier is that for these under 2 megawatt facilities, and any company could certainly, I see there's a couple more here now, I suspect that the company will always have the consent because the interconnection agreement's not individually negotiated. It's just standard language, which would make sense. I think that would be the appropriate way to do it. Quite frankly, I'd be surprised if it wasn't that way. So, I don't know if am I correct in that, Mr. Seegers?
Your Honor, I apologize. I was conferring with my counsel when you were, can you repeat what your...
Sure. The question that I had is, for under 2 megawatt generator facilities, are the interconnection agreements negotiated independently, or is it a standard interconnection form that a individual customer would receive and would need to sign? And my suspicion is that in those documents, for the reasons that Mr. Trout raised earlier, safety reasons being primary among them, that the customer would be providing consent to have the facility controlled by the utility, assuming the utility does it or doesn't. Whether they do it or not is another issue. but that the customer would at least be providing consent to the utility company to control it in the event they needed to do so in the future. I guess my question is, would it be possible for a under 2 megawatt customer facility to enter into an interconnection agreement with the utility where they can refuse to provide that consent?
I think that certainly would be possible, Commissioner. To answer your first question, the standard interconnection agreement that is used for facilities under 2 megawatts, that is the standard agreement that has been approved by the Commission, and that is a document that we present to all interconnection customers, and but there's also a portion at the end where it's basically it's a fill in the blank where it has all the specifications of that specific interconnection. So I think that the interconnection agreement that could certainly be updated so that the customer would have the option of giving their consent or not giving their consent to the monitoring and control.
Okay. I guess I'll just ask, is that something that the companies would be willing to allow? Where a customer could interconnect with the utility system, generating facility, interconnect with your system, but not provide the utility company with the ability to control that system at all?
The way that I'm sorry, Commissioner. The way that the rules are currently set up is that if the customer does not consent, and then we don't have a plan in place that's been approved by the Commission, then I don't believe that we have grounds to refuse that interconnection.
Respectfully, Commissioner, I disagree with my colleague. I believe that, for example, if the customer hasn't agreed to let us cut them off, if we're in an outage and we need to work on their line and there's a risk that their generator is going to be energizing the line we need to work on, we're not going to let them connect to the system in the first place. And we couldn't safely do that. So I think we may be, each of us may be interpreting your question differently, and that's leading to the difference in result. But I know that the standard agreements, for example, I know for sure that they let us exercise a certain amount of control because we can cut them if we have to work on the line. Period. End of story. Right. And that's in the standard agreement. So.
Right. I think that's fair, and I know Mr. Seegers was engaged in several conversations, so I understand I suspect that's what that both of you were hearing it a little differently, but I don't know how far down the hole we want to go.
I think we found lots of weeds here. At this point, it's angels dancing on the head of a pin. I'm going to call a soft vote on my proposal to strike regulation J4 and approve the remainder. All in favor say
Mr. Chairman, can I ask you a question?
yes. Commissioner
Are
O'Donnell.
you talking about going back to the original language that exists? You're talking about striking J4 completely?
Striking J4 completely. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure what we're voting
No.
on here.
Clear. In the presentation deck before us, I propose that we strike both the red line and the black line associated with J4. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. All opposed?
Aye.
Okay. Now, 3-2, we will make these changes and move on to the next item. And Mr. Borkowski, as I said, if it's consensus and the commissioners don't have any questions, we could move forward. Or if any parties have any concerns with what is being billed as consensus, we move on.
Okay. I would like to next go to slide 15. And I really feel like, even though this is a consensus section, just because of our recommendations in the back, I need to mention that, we are proposing a smart inverter requirement in Maryland. It was part of the commission charge to our work group to investigate whether we should have a smart inverter requirement in Maryland, similar to some of the other states like California and Hawaii. And we had a consensus in the work group that by January 1st, 2022, we require smart inverters in Maryland. To do that, there's a lot of precursor work that needs to be done. And what we're proposing is, because utilities are already working, I know the Exelon utilities are working on their inverter standards. Some utilities may not be working on inverter standards, especially some of the smaller utilities, but I think would be a benefit to have, and the work group feels it would be a benefit to have a statewide standard in Maryland, and what we're proposing is a workshop in early 2021 to look at where the utilities are at with regards to developing their smart inverter settings policies, with a goal of recommending a statewide policy that could be used in Maryland. So just wanted to highlight that when I say it could be used, there still will be the ability for utilities to have utility-specific inverter policies are different than the statewide inverter standard, and certainly for site-specific issues, generators may, in their interconnection agreements, agree to have site-specific inverter requirements based on a particular operational characteristics of the circuit. But I just felt like, even though it's consensus, it's important that the commission recognize that there is some significant effort that has to be undertaken to implement smart inverters in Maryland, and we're recommending that the commission approve our plans to go forward with a workshop to try to synthesize what the utilities are doing and come back and propose a statewide standard. Okay, any questions on that?
Thank you. I appreciate the fact that we do have a hard deadline here of January 1st, 2022 to move the parties forward. Commissioner Richard or O'Donnell?
Where is the IEEE 1547 reference in the regs?
Well, right now, IEEE 1547-2014 is referenced in the 20.50.0202 section. We made that change with RM61. We are not recommending changing to the 2018 standard yet, because we don't yet have some of the components, some of the necessary additional things from a standards perspective done. Namely, there's an IEEE 1547.1 that's still being developed, and there's also a Underwriters Lab 1741 standard that's still being developed. The timeline for development of that will be, that work should all be completed in 2020, which is really associated with the timing of what we want to do in early 2021, and then subsequently implement this smart inverter standard in 2022. But having a statewide standard will especially benefit some of the smaller utilities, because if we can have a statewide standard, at least when those manufacturers ship those inverters, there are defaults that are used in Maryland, and as opposed to not having any guidance at all. And I think that that is just a starting point, the statewide standard, and certainly we would encourage all utilities to use a statewide standard, but different utilities will have different operational needs, and they may need to have their own utility specific.
The reason I asked the question was because I have concern about cybersecurity, and these standards don't address it, even the 2018 version of 1547. So I'm concerned about the lack of cybersecurity requirements in the standard. So, thank you.
Okay, so with that, I think we can skip to the next non-consensus area, which is slide 18. And right off the bat, I will note that we did not have consensus with some of the items we were recommending with regard to facility costs, and it was on the record during the work group meeting, and I guess we did get some additional non-consensus, from different stakeholders, mainly MEA staff and Sunrun expressed that they have different thoughts. I won't go into all of them at this point. What I would like to recommend at this point is that, a lot of what we were trying to do in this section was really codify existing practice. It's unwritten right now in our regulations that we have, really a cause or pay policy in Maryland, meaning anybody that's interconnecting, if they cause an upgrade, they pay. It's not written in regulations specifically. We were just codifying the fact that that's the existing practice. But there are other models that are out there. We really could have difficulty moving forward on other models, but given that there's significant non-consensus here, this is an area where I would just offer that, the commission may want to have us explore further options and continue to try to build consensus. And if the commission has any direction for us, we would welcome that. But as proposed, I think we're just codifying existing practice for the most part here, and maybe addressing a little bit, some issues related to canceled and speculative projects.
Chief, where would you envision those additional discussions take place? In phase 3?
Well, and the work group will know that I was not in favor of phase 3 because I like to declare that we finished something. Yeah, it would be essentially a phase 3 effort with stakeholders who were, wanted to be engaged in this. Not all stakeholders in a work group are interested in every particular topic, but
If either MEA or Sunrun would like to briefly explain their positions, now would be the time. Seeing none,
Mr. Borkowski, just wanted to clarify, are you suggesting that we not adopt O, or that we adopt it and that you keep working on it?
well, the work group, and keep in mind that, and I should have explained this up front, this is a work group report, not a staff report.
Well, you just
You
made a
know,
recommendation,
right,
Mr. Borkowski,
and
so I'm
I'm,
asking what, just
right.
trying technically, are you saying that we should just
I'm
not
just-
adopt this, and let it go as uncodified, or?
What I'm saying is the work group, this was the consensus from the work group. It was not entire consensus. All I'm saying is if the commission decided not to go forward with this, it really, it wouldn't have a major impact, 'cause this is existing practice. Now it just means that existing practice isn't codified.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying. But I don't feel like, because the work group submitted this report, I have to remember my role.
thank you, Chief. Do the commissioners have any comments on 6O? Commissioner O'Donnell.
I just wanted to say, maybe say obvious, but that Sunrun's position and MEA's position are diametrically opposed. So they're not both opposed to this from the same direction.
Noted. And do we have MEA representative here today with us? We do not. Okay.
I guess we can ask them, because I thought their position was that it's paid up front and then the applicants are paid later, or that may be the Sunrun position, so.
I believe that's
Yeah,
the Sunrun
Sunrun
position.
position,
Is
okay.
Ms. Sidor? Yes.
That is his, okay,
Ms.
so-
Sidoron, is that your position? Did Commissioner Richard, I believe he accurately
Okay, that was,
described that you wish the utility to pay upfront. Is that right?
So we offered that as an example of a potential way to cost share in the future. We're not, in our comments, we weren't necessarily asking for the commission to make a ruling on that. But it's an issue, cost allocation of these expenses is very complicated, and so that was an option that we thought made sense and is worthy of further conversation, but we're not requesting action today on that.
Okay.
That's an important point, so thank you for sharing that, and it appears to dovetails with the work group leader's statement. Okay. Additional discussion on 6O?
So at this point, are we looking at just deferring on taking action on this today, or what's before us?
I
What was just
believe-
what was the recommendation of?
I believe the chief's recommendation is to approve this text as being consistent with commission
Okay,
policy.
approved. And was there a request for, I guess, guidance that the work group continue to look at this cost allocation method?
Yes,
As at some point, with the expectation of large input of DERs into our system, we may face issues in the future. Is that correct?
yeah, I think there are very valid points, about the pros and cons of the existing causer model. I mean, if you want to interconnect a lot of generation in Maryland, you want to remove obstacles, and one of the obstacles is the fact that it will cost a lot of money in some cases for developers to interconnect. And, if they're interconnecting and then later on people are coming in and sharing the benefits and not paying, that in itself is a little bit problematic. So I think it's one of those things that, our recommendation from the work group is there's a lot of work in the industry. There's no model out there. We were recommending that we codify existing practice, but continue, possibly looking at this in the future and bringing back some of the best practices.
The question of who pays is always the most complex. Commission staff.
Yes, good afternoon, David Hoppick, on behalf of Commission staff. So, staff requests that the Commission suspend a decision on this section and have the working group continue to work on it and not adopt anything on this specifically, such that we're not codifying current practice.
Well, why is that, Mr. Hoppick?
So the concern is that codifying existing practice does exactly that. It codifies a situation where basically it depends on where you are on the line. If you're early enough in the line, you get to interconnect without having to pay for any distribution system upgrades. But if you're later in the line, you do have to pay for a distribution system upgrade. And we think especially for small interconnections, so like the rooftop solar, individual, if they're on that particular part of the distribution system, this would likely effectively close a section of the distribution system for them. Because if you're talking about a really small system and having to pay for an upgrade to system capacity, that would likely be a significant impact on the cost decision. So rather than codifying it, putting it off until the work group has more time to look into this issue.
Does it provide any, I imagine it does provide uncertainty to have a hole in the regulations with respect to cost allocation while the work group continues its discussions? How do you
So the uncertainty would be equivalent to what it is now.
without codification?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Sears.
Good afternoon, Matt Seegers appearing for Pepco and Delmarva Power. Just two quick responses to Mr. Hoppick's comments. First of all, the challenge of deferring this further is that the work group was not able to come to a complete consensus on this issue. And I personally don't believe that additional time would yield a complete consensus just because of the fact that we weren't able to reach it on the first time around. And in response to Mr. Hoppick's concern about a large generator coming in and taking up all of the available capacity on a distribution line so that those later on in the line would have to pay upgrade costs. That is addressed in another portion of these regulations under the hosting capacity analyses. So I know that for the PHI utilities, we have our hosting capacity analyses where once a line gets to a certain point, we restrict the number, the kind of generators that can interconnect with that line to anything below a certain threshold, so that we can maintain a capacity for as many customers as possible. So I think that the regulations as they currently are, they do address that concern that Mr. Hoppick expressed.
That was my understanding, that the hosting capacity analysis will allow smaller facilities not to get blocked and pay for the interconnection costs just because a larger facility absorbed all that capacity. Mr. Hoppick, do you see the interplay between the...
So I agree that he's referring to section Q, hosting capacity. It helps address the situation of a larger, say, commercial project, knowing exactly how much capacity is on the line and requesting all of that capacity. If you have reserve capacity, that should help a bit, but you're still going to reach a point at which you've used up that reserve capacity, and everybody who was in the line before that has no distribution interconnection costs, distribution system upgrade costs, excuse me, and those after do. And so especially for, you know, the roof type solar scenario, you're going to have situations where you're treating one customer very different from another customer because of, you know, when they lined up in the queue.
Just one response to that, Your Honor. The proposed regulations anticipate that the utilities would be able to come in with a plan to open up closed or restricted circuits. And I think it would be at that point when, if a utility wanted to make upgrades on its distribution system to benefit all customers, then that's a discussion that we can have at that time when we're looking at a specific plan. Because I don't think that is going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. I think each utility is going to come in with its own restricted or closed feeders and be able to say, here's what we can do to open these up. And then in terms of whether or not that is just or reasonable, or if there should be cost recovery, that could be a discussion that we could have at that time, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Seegers. I do tend to agree with you, but I always take caution when I disagree with the Commission's independent staff. Mr. Hoppick?
May I respond to that?
Please.
So, you know, if you're codifying, you know, section O explicitly says that if distribution system upgrades are required as a result of an interconnection study, the project in the interconnection queue that causes the need for the upgrade project shall pay the full utility cost of the planned upgrade. So if that is codified in COMAR, and the utility under section Q hosting capacity says, you know what, we've got a closed circuit or a restricted circuit, we need to come in, you know, as I read that other section of COMAR, it's going to, whatever their proposal is to upgrade that, the other section of COMAR seems to say, well, the person who's causing the need for the upgrade has to pay. So
Thank you. Do commissioners have thoughts on this particular section? I would support including the language, recognizing that it could be revisited later, although once codified, sometimes it's more difficult to change.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from the argument I just heard from staff, I guess I'm concerned that the hosting capacity section would be in conflict with this facility cost section. If we codify that, you know, the last applicant pays, then does that allow us to, you know, assuming we adopt the hosting capacity section, if we get this hosting capacity plan and we want to come up with something, an alternative to the last applicant pays, are we already locked out because we've enacted, or we have adopted this facility cost?
Mr. Hoppick, you're saying that there's a conflict between O2 and Q?
So what I'm saying is, I think O2 would lock in how you would pay for an upgrade under Q2. So if you're upgrading hosting capacity, if you're saying, well, the person who's causing the need to pay for upgrades to hosting capacity has to pay, then the person paying for the need to, I think you would make it harder or maybe impossible for some sort of cost sharing or cost socialization under Q2.
Yeah, so.
Mr. Seegers, do you have any response to that?
Your Honor, I'm trying to follow that, Mr. Hoppick's statement. A utility would be coming in to open up closed or restricted circuits to benefit all of our customers, not just for one interconnection. So I don't see a conflict between a utility coming in and saying, here's our plan to open up these restricted or closed circuits. We're talking about a circuit, or I think in this case it would be a closed circuit. This case, it's a circuit that nobody can interconnect to. Once that circuit is opened up, if the commission approved that plan, then the facilities that, and this, once that circuit is opened up, I don't think that would change the policy that anyone who wanted to interconnect to that newly opened up circuit still has to pay for any upgrades that are needed for their individual connection.
Thank you. That does make sense to me, because I see that they are in the aggregate here in Q2. Okay, I am supportive of the regs in 6.0. I would ask my other colleagues to state their positions.
I don't know, I still have enough uncertainty raised by the concern that Mr. Hoppick that and hearing that we don't really need to have Section O, I would like us just to hold off until we can maybe work out any potential conflicts with the hosting capacity, Section Q.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to default to the status quo ante, and vote not to adopt this new language to codify, just because I'm uncertain as to its impact.
Thank you. Commissioner Linton?
I am also going to vote not to include this language for two reasons. One, I think that because we have new RPS goals now, some of our current status quo policies may not be the ones that help get us to the new goals that we're looking to. That the state policy is established by our General Assembly and our Governor. I don't know that those new policies will be that these current policies will be the ones that get us to the new RPS goal. And secondly, I think there's several areas of conflict, which also means there are areas of opportunity to make these facility costs and a little more beneficial for consumers. I think there's some openings in here that I can't talk about now, but I see them in here.
Thank you. Commissioner Herman, I need not your vote, but if you would like to provide.
I would have voted to approve them, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so for a vote of 3-2, 6.0 will not be included on the vote count later on this afternoon. Move to the next slide, Mr. Borkowski.
Okay, I will say, and I know consistent with your direction, I'm gonna go through, and bypass energy storage option, but I did want to just make mention that this is a significant accomplishment of the group, reaching consensus here, and, I appreciate, all the stakeholders working, to that end.
Thank you for flagging that. I know that we had comments from a number, including Energy Storage Association, who I see in the audience today. And of course, if the chief is going too quickly, which I would be surprised if he is, but if he's not, commissioners, please feel free to slow us down.
Okay, so notwithstanding any comments on that, the next section I would like to talk about is hosting capacity on slide 21. And we did have a lot of consensus here. However, I think while some of the stakeholders had no issues with what we were proposing as far as regulatory language and our direction, they would like this to go further than what we proposed. So I will say that we had supporting comments from a lot of utilities, but IREC in particular, who's very active in promoting hosting capacity analysis, is proposing establishing a future comprehensive hosting capacity analysis requirement. And Sunrun is also proposing that non-wire alternatives be included in hosting capacity upgrade plans. And staff had some comments about possibly implementing minimum reserve hosting capacity requirements. So, so we did have a few additional comments, but in general, I also consider this to be a significant accomplishment of the work group, and I do want to recognize Exelon and the PHI utilities. They are very much out in front in this area, and what we did in this area is codify a lot of the best practices that are currently employed with the PHI utilities, and we married that with a lot of the work that IREC has done to come up with these proposals. I really feel that this is innovative, codifying the concepts of restricted circuits, closed circuits, reserve hosting capacity, and I do think it'll remove barriers to the implementation of solar, particularly when you're reserving hosting capacity to allow rooftop solar interconnections that might be prohibited if you did not do that. So I do think that with that, before we get to any further discussion, I think there's probably some other stakeholders that may want to make a statement or two here, so I'm going to just stop.
I'm looking, I don't see anybody standing up. Oh, now I do. Okay. And at any time, parties, if you wish to be recognized, just if you approach the podium, I'll signal you.
Sure, I was waiting for the cue. Thanks. Sarah Baldwin, Vice President of Regulatory with IREC. Very much appreciate all of the work that's gone in, and definitely want to give kudos to John Borkowski for his excellent work in leading our Phase 2 effort. On the topic of hosting capacity analyses, the group discussed this at length, and I would agree with John's assessment that this is a great step forward, particularly in light of the work that PEPCO and Exelon have done in terms of doing their own work on hosting capacity analysis. I would say they certainly stand out in the country as far as what a utility has done on their own. Our recommendation to, at some future point, have this commission consider a more statewide and universal framework for hosting capacity analysis that applies to all the utilities is really based on our experience working in a number of states on this topic. And, hosting capacity is a tool. And like any tool, if you don't know what it's used for or why you're doing it, it can be a great waste of time to go down that rabbit hole, as we've talked about rabbit holes today. And so by providing a framework that the commission establishes for all the utilities to move towards at some future point, that allows there to be greater consistency among the utilities and how they're approaching it, more consistency among the methodologies that are chosen, and effectively just a more useful tool for consumers, regulators, developers, and the utilities themselves. I think, the framework and the language that's been adopted here, again, want to reiterate, we're in consensus with this being a good first step, but just want to consider the opportunity for a future next iteration and conversation on this important topic. And there is a lot of details that go into this that are not reflected in this pretty minimal language.
Thank you. We appreciate IREC's participation in the work group.
Great. It's been fun. I hope we have phase 3, just because otherwise we're going to miss each other. Thank you so much. Any other questions?
Yeah,
Sorry.
just so I understand your recommendation, then you don't have anything specific to add to the proposed regulation. Are you just calling us to continue the work group process and maybe some kind of a mandate that the utilities develop this hosting capacity analysis?
Correct. Yeah, I think this language is a good first step, but it's not enough to kind of leave it at this. I think, certainly the commission should come back and review what the utilities are working on, and to the extent the commission wants to see interim steps along the way, we certainly encourage that. In fact, feel that it's very important that the utilities provide interim updates with stakeholder input before the tool is finalized, because that allows for input in terms of, again, the methodologies, what it's going to be used for, how it's going to be structured, and that there's greater consistency among the different utilities, especially given the fact that there are so many utilities in a relatively small footprint.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much.
Mr. Hoppick.
David Hoppick, again on behalf of staff. So just a little clarity on staff's position. We're good with the language of Hugh as written. We would just note that there is an interplay with the section we just talked about, interconnection facility costs. We would simply note that it may be necessary, depending on the outcome of where we go on that, to revisit this. So I just wanted to make that statement.
There is a connection. And on the screen, I see that staff has a proposal regarding a date certain by which to establish minimums.
So we discussed that a bit further internally, and I think we've moved a bit on that position to for this round, that coming up with a numeric number might not be key, but we would like to not have it drag out, such that sooner rather than later there is this system to reserve capacity for the small guys.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. If the utilities haven't caught the drift yet, there is a sense of urgency here with respect to all of these efforts. So the faster we could do the mapping or the hosting capacity minimums, or getting the smart inverters standardized, the better. Thank you, Mr. Seegers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hoppick, firstly, he already took care of one of my comments, because we were going to respond to staff's proposal to establish minimum requirements for all feeders, but it sounds like staff is no longer proposing that, so that takes care of my first comment. And then I just also wanted to highlight just a wordsmithing change that the Exelon Utilities had proposed. It's at the bottom of slide 22. Just when we read the language to open, closed, or restricted circuits in the aggregate, we just wanted to just a proposed change to make it a little bit more clear to open multiple closed or restricted circuits, just to make it clear that when we come in with our plans, it won't be just to open up one closed circuit. We're going to be coming with a plan to open it. It could be just one circuit, but that it could also be that we're going to be opening up multiple closed or restricted circuits. So it's a wordsmithing change, if nothing else, Your Honor.
Thank you, and thank you for submitting that to the commission in advance. Do any parties, work group leader, or staff have opposition to this relatively minor change?
I don't.
Okay, seeing none, do any commissioners? No. Okay. Those changes therefore will be incorporated into Q6Q.
I'm gonna go back.
Yes, at this point, now that we're done with 6Q, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, Commissioner O'Donnell noted with respect to 6P, the energy storage options, that was also the area where we had the issue of inadvertent exports.
Right.
Reading the work group report, I thought there was non-consensus.
Yes, let me address it. We did not get non-consensus comments. There was a concern expressed by one of the technical members from one of the utilities that they may not have the analytical tools to be able to evaluate inadvertent exports' impact on reliability, and that there's further work. In fact, this individual cited that EPRI's got a current project looking at some of these analytical tools. However, we, in our proposal, as a work group proposal, we are giving utilities the ability to specify the magnitude and duration of inadvertent export they approve. So ultimately, they do have some control over it. We want to encourage that they approve inadvertent export. But I think that the non-consensus, and it didn't come out in the comments, nobody submitted comment, but the non-consensus was around just the analytical tools.
Yeah, I mean, that's significant. That's why I backed this up. It's significant to this, Commissioner. First of all, this says there was consensus reached and there was on this side. And that, if you recall in round one, this and in other proceedings, this particular issue has gotten a lot of discussion in this hearing room. And I'm not sure that I agree with this. I know that's contrary to what the advocates want here, but I'm not convinced yet that we've figured out the impact on reverse powering these systems for a short period of time and saying it's okay. So,
Well,
when it's not supposed to be there, when it's unexpected, and that's, to me, that's just my technician's mind telling me, if you shouldn't have power there, you shouldn't allow it.
I feel like when we're talking about inadvertent export, we're not talking about inadvertently energizing something that should be dead. We're just talking about the fact that you're exceeding a limit for a very short period of time, and then your controls are taking over and you're pulling it back. The problem is, and I think that PHI was able to educate me a lot on what they've been dealing with, especially with some of these Tesla Powerwalls. You really can't have a Tesla Powerwall operate without inadvertent exports,
So
because
give me some assurance that we're not talking about power, electrifying something that shouldn't be electrifying by an inadvertent export.
you're not inadvertently.
Why? Tell me why. Don't just tell me yes.
Because it's
tell me why.
it's an interconnected system, and basically, if there were a loss of a circuit, you have other controls that would trip that unit off. So this is a different.
So there would be reverse power protection of some sort. Is that what I mean?
Well, there's anti-islanding protection. You don't want to have generators inadvertently energize a circuit that should be dead.
Exactly.
But this is not the same thing as that. Inadvertent export means that you're interconnected. There's nothing dead there. It just means that you're temporarily exceeding a limit, because of the fact that load dropped off, and your generator controls and your energy storage controls aren't fast enough to be able, to instantaneously correct it. So we're talking about exceeding a limit just for a few cycles or a few seconds, so it's not a safety issue. It's a reliability issue, which is why we, put some limits on the duration and magnitude, but it's not a safety.
Right, I'll just accept that at face value, although I'm not convinced. I'll just accept because our chief engineer tells me that that's what it is. But, and I'm willing to do that, but I just have concerns about this, and I didn't like kind of blowing through this as a consensus issue if the utilities still have concerns as well.
Yeah, well, and I apologize for not, highlighting it, but I don't know if the view was just expressed by one individual in the company. And I have to say, you know, the person who expressed this was from Potomac Edison. And I don't know if Potomac Edison wants to speak to this or not, but they did not file comments indicating non-consensus, so that's why it did not end up in this slide deck.
I'm going to try to rescue Mr. Bukowski here because he's been carrying our water on this issue and he shouldn't have to. You are correct, Commissioner, that in prior versions of this proceeding we have raised this issue. And while we still were not 100% satisfied on a measurement issue, not a safety issue. I agree 100% without, although since I'm not an engineer, that doesn't give you any more real comfort. There was still a measurement issue, at least for us, but it was not of a sufficient magnitude that we felt the need either to file written comments on this issue or for me to stand up and put myself forward to object to it. We can live with this for the reasons that Mr. Bukowski explained at the beginning. And given all the progress that's been made on this whole set of issues, we didn't want to be disruptive. And that's where we are.
Okay.
Thank you. At this time, why don't we take a 10-minute break? We'll reconvene at 3 p.m. We are back on the record in rulemaking proceeding RM68. Chief Borkowski, I believe we are now on slide 23, is that right?
Correct, but the next several slides, I don't plan on covering because they were all consensus slides, so unless there are any questions, I would like to take you to slide 29. Here we made an error. I don't recommend the deletion to the left, and I would recommend the commission just keep the existing language with the exception that we capitalize section to be consistent with the way we're capitalized. So apologize for that. Moving on, the next slide I would like to take you to, unless there are any questions, is slide 35. I just want to point out that because of the fact that we did not approve the wording in the section related to cost allocation, which was 20.50.09060, that this deletion is no longer applicable. Because part of what we moved this section from this particular area Comar up to that O section. So if we don't approve the O section, we have to leave this in, and this is existing regulation.
Thank you, Chief. So 12E 3E will return to its current form in black line, which is currently in the Comar.
Right.
Okay.
And the very next slide, slide 36, we did have another deletion error, and I apologize for this also. F1 and F2 should not have been deleted, and the proposed wording changes are shown in the box for F1 and F2. The red indicating, the black indicating existing regulation, and the red just being the changes that we're recommending, and they're minor changes, so I don't expect changes to the consensus status for this section. Okay, and unless there are any questions, I'll move on to slide 38. One other cleanup item, and I think I have to explain ourselves. When we were working on these regulations, particularly when it came to net system capacity and nameplate capacity, we were wrestling with how to deal with these things, and we introduced a term called peak interconnection capacity, which we later reversed ourselves on and decided not to use, but unfortunately we left that term in 20.50.09.14A8, and what I'm recommending at the very bottom, the red line where it says peak interconnection capacity, that should say nameplate capacity. And I don't think there'll be any stakeholder objections to that. So a few cleanup items, and with that, unless there are any questions, I would like to just go to slide 42. I think we've gone through all the proposed regulations, and would like to just revisit the work group objectives and talk about next steps, unless the commission wants to stop and revisit anything at this point.
I had a question, Mr. Chairman, for this is on page 38, under the records retention section.
Yes.
There were a number of already existing itemized types of records that needed to be retained. Do you think there's a need, and I know some parts of Comar we have like a catch-all, other items as requested or something like that. We have a lot of things already listed here. Do you think we've sufficiently covered everything, or do you think there's a need to add a type of catch-all in the end in the event there's some new item that we didn't think about?
Well, I think if we were to have a catch-all, I still think you need to have some specificity as to what you're trying to do. And I think this just came up, these record retention, as things we would possibly ask questions about, so, I really feel like a catch-all is probably not something that you can easily define. So, because there are really a lot of different aspects of regulation. I think all utilities, and correct me, one of the lawyers, if I'm wrong, but there is, because we were researching this at one point, there is a regulation that requires, and this is a federal regulation, I believe, that requires utility operating records to be kept for 5 years.
Right.
Here we're just saying 7 years, so I do think that, to some extent that is a catch-all, but I don't recall the actual statute or,
Yeah, it's in another section of Comar. I know which one you're talking about. And that could be sufficient, but like I said, we have a lot identified here, so if there wasn't something additional, that's fine. I just was asking just to be sure. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay, talking about the work group objectives, when the commission initiated PC 44 work groups, and the PC 44 interconnection work group was one of them, we had several objectives. So I repeated those objectives. I really felt like through phase 1 and the leadership of John Kuskar, and through phase 2 with the engagement of all the stakeholders, I feel like we have done a lot to accomplish the objectives that originally set out for this work group. I do feel like we've identified that we need to possibly look into cost allocation a little bit further, but I do think, and there's a more thorough discussion in the final report of how we felt we met each one of these. So at this point, rather than go through all these, I'll just ask the commission if you have any reactions to the work group's efforts as far as meeting the original objectives that you set out for us. Any additional things that we should be dealing with?
Chief, obviously I wasn't here at the start of PC 44, but under your leadership, both Phase 1 and Phase 2 have reached levels of consensus that I could have only dreamed of. So we've made a lot of progress in that time to reduce barriers, to streamline the processes, to allow our DERs to more easily connect to the grid. Obviously, there is still some work ahead. I know that through the comments that were filed, there are some recommendations, non-regulatory text-related recommendations that can be addressed today if the parties wish to pose those questions directly to the commissioners from the podium, or in a supplemental request for additional guidance that could be done on paper, but perhaps more expeditious today. I would also, I know were joking earlier with respect to the need for a phase three, or do we close this out successfully with phase two? Obviously, there's more discussions, not only on cost allocation, but some other issues I identified today, and we need to have a hosting capacity, place to house that. So I'll end it there with those general comments, but be curious to hear from my fellow commissioners as well.
Yeah, I would just comment that I think your potential additional tasks section, captured, I think, a lot of our discussion today, and to the extent that, as commissioners, we can give you guidance that I think particularly in the area of hosting capacity, and then the three bullets below that, I think IREC, Sunrun, and staff all had important comments, and it would be great to see some proposals come out of that as far as, what can we do to have that hosting capacity analysis, those mapped, because I think we all agree that we have a big task ahead of us to try to help our state meet its goals with the RPS, and that's going to be a key roadmap for how we get things done. So I think to the extent that we can require the utilities to provide that information, I think that'll be important for the state policy. And it'll also be, I think, informative. We have the governor's task force right now looking at siting. I think that would benefit from having this type of information available. So I would highly endorse pretty much everything under your potential tasks, but particularly the hosting capacity section.
By the way, Commissioner Richards referring to slide 43, because I hadn't moved to slide 43, but I guess DeAndre did.
Oh, I thought you were already at the...
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I didn't get kind of hard figuring out where we're at, yeah.
Before we go to slide 43, can we finish up slide 41, or do you want to go back to slide 41 after that?
Sure.
Not 41,
42, I think.
42. Commissioner Richards, you done with 42?
I'm done with 42,
Okay.
or 43.
So, just a general comment about meeting the goals. I think you've done an excellent job. I think there's a lot more consensus this time around in phase two than there was in phase one. I just sense that, and that's positive. I also think that there is more work to do. We'll get into that when we get to the next slide, but when we get there, keep in mind that IEEE 1547 2018 version, which took forever to get to us, it felt like, is going to be modified, and I think it's going to need to address certain specific things, including cybersecurity of these smart inverters, and if not 0.1, certainly some future version, and we're going to have to account for that at some level, whether or not it's in the working group or some other proceeding. We'll figure that out, but just keep that in mind going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would echo the comments of both of all of my colleagues who spoke thus far. I would also, I was on 43, so I'm trying to stay on 42 now. I think that, yeah, I'll leave it at that. I'll wait till we go to 43. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we already started in 43, so.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case then, on I guess this would be the fourth bullet. I think that one is one of particular importance in terms of monitoring industry trends. And I would add to that state policy and some of the information that we'll be able to obtain through the new reporting requirements. I know they were consensus, and we didn't speak to them directly, but there's a number of new types of information that we'll be obtaining from the companies, and the parties will be able to look at them starting April of next year. So I think that we'll learn some more about how the industry is developing through that as well. And I'll add that I know earlier you noted that you'd like to see an end to this work group because you want to feel as though we've accomplished something. I think we've accomplished a great deal here. And I'll tell you that when you get back to your office after this hearing is adjourned, you'll feel like it's over. Because, you'll be done with this part, and the next piece, or next phase, if it's called phase 3 or whatever, will be as important. So, you only get a rest for a little bit, but after that, you're right back into it.
And Chief, let me get your opinion on whether it would be more beneficial if the commission directs a phase 3 of the work group, or you maintain your position as work group leader and meet on an as-needed basis at your discretion. Do you have thoughts on that as the commission considers where we are going from here?
Yes, I do. In fact, I had some comments during the break, or some discussion during the break with some of the other stakeholders about next steps. I have a group of 130 some individuals, and some of them are just monitoring, but some of them are very engaged. And I think you've seen some of that engagement here today and through some of the filings. I do not feel like we need to meet as frequently in the future, but I think we can handle some of the things that have been identified today in subgroups, and then meet periodically with a larger group to kind of look at things. And certainly when we get to 2021 and we start to deal with things like statewide, smart inverter settings, we'll probably have to meet more frequently. But, so I do see a need, particularly for maintenance of some of the things that we've already started to continue to meet. But there are some things left undone, particularly in the facility cost area, where we really need to do some more work, as evidenced by the discussion today. So I envision, having a subgroup dedicated to working on that, and coming back at some point with recommendations for rulemaking to the commission. And certainly the hosting capacity analysis, although we are starting with some concepts, there's some things to build on there, and we can have another subgroup related to that. So I see a couple major areas of focus, and certainly even the utility monitoring and control plans. Although we got a regulation, it sounds like maybe there's some more things that we could discuss on that. So my opinion, without rambling on too long, is that there's enough meat here to deputize a few subgroups, and keep the larger group together, and kind of just continue to plow on.
Thank you, Chief. Anything additional on 43 that we did not discuss or should highlight? At this time, I'll ask if any of the parties and participants to the work group would like to address the commission on any items or recommendations or requests for guidance. Seeing none. Oh, no, just putting on your jacket.
Nope.
I have one housekeeping matter, and then Commissioner Linton has a question. Oh, okay.
Good afternoon.
I thought you were getting ready to go. Yes.
I don't mean to slow this proceeding down. So, Andrew Levitt, senior architect at PJM Interconnection. Just want to thank and commend the commission for tackling this really weedy topic. I think it came up several times. There are angels dancing on the head of a pin. All of that is correct. Also, thanks to John Borkowski for leading the work group through all these issues. PJM offered our support for the two topics of interest for us, which was clarifying the jurisdictional division between FERC's jurisdiction over wholesale interconnections and the state's jurisdiction over the distribution system. This will increase transparency and clarity for PJM customers who are interconnecting under Maryland authority. That's increasingly important, especially with energy storage resources seeking to make wholesale sales as well as provide retail value. In the domain of smart inverters, one piece of that is ride-through. PJM has a technical interest in that, This is really important for accommodating large deployments of distributed energy resources in a way that preserves reliability and efficiency, and I think that we really came to a good solution there. So PJM's very happy, and again, just want to commend all the work that you all have done. The Maryland Commission is really leading PJM states in this regard, and I think that's going to be beneficial for PJM and our stakeholders as well.
Thank you, Mr. Levitt. And just to be clear, that your proposed change to Regulation N4, I'm not sure what chapter that's in, that was included in the proposed regulations that we discussed today.
I don't believe we had proposed changes, John.
Oh, okay. I'm reading this too quickly then.
Yeah, no, it was just a clarification. We have posted a voluntary guideline through a stakeholder process at PJM, where we invited distribution utilities and other stakeholders to work out the technical details of ride-through, what would meet PJM needs and still be acceptable on the distribution system. It's really quite deep in the weeds.
Right. This is the PJMDR ride-through guideline.
Exactly right.
Thank you.
And so the suggestion is that that guideline document be considered the guidance coming out of PJM that is referenced in the code provisions here.
Thank you, Mr. Levitt, for your participation and for PJM's involvement in this work group as well.
Thank you.
Commissioner Linton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just had a question about the appendix items had some reporting templates, which I don't mean to prolong the hearing, but I was hoping that if the chief could just kind of give us a general comment about how these would be used and the purpose of them. Is this, so this would be what we would look to receive in several months?
We just wanted to provide in the appendix just an illustration of type of templates that we're recommending the utilities use when reporting the new information reporting requirements. DeAndre has worked up these templates. Actually, most of the utilities are using the templates we prepared in the past. These are just the modifications that reflect on the new information. So I didn't feel the need to go over them, but I wanted to highlight that I think that you know, they're not that onerous, the additional requirements in my opinion, and just illustrate you know, the format of type of information we get back.
And
we would request to get back.
And is it fair to say that these are consensus documents from the work group?
We had consensus on the regulations that are the basis for this. Now, not every utility uses the template, and we're not requiring that. We prefer they use the template, but as long as they're meeting COMAR, that's satisfactory. But most of the utilities are using our templates.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Linton. Noting that all of our discussions today, Chief Borkowski, were with respect to Chapter 9, did we make any revisions to Chapter 2? Because I see that one of your red line tariff sheets involved Chapter 2, but there was actually no red line on it.
Yeah, it's, we felt we needed to include just some commentary, and we did in part of the final report in the section where we indicated that we will eventually have to change O2, but we're waiting until the new UL 1741 standard and the IEEE 1547.1 standard are approved in 2020, and then we will have to come back and change the O2 section. So, you know, we didn't want to recommend that we make changes to incorporate IEEE 1547-2018 at this point, and that's different than IEEE 1547-2018 or .1 2008 or .1, let's just say.
So we will be making changes in the future, but not
We will
today.
make changes in the future, and we didn't want to lose that fact. These work group efforts affect both those sections, but we had no changes to recommend in that particular section at this point in time.
Thank you for that clarification. I trust your leadership to continue the good work. I think it is important to provide some labels. So if my colleagues agree or if they disagree with me, I'd like to hear that. But I believe that we should, at the conclusion of today's hearing, begin the initiation of phase 3 of the work group proceedings. And I see no visible objections to that. Under your continued leadership and addressing these issues such as facility costs, the smart inverters, and the hosting capacity analysis. Before we conclude with our motion approving the regulations to be published in the Maryland Register, is there any additional business from the work group leader or from any of the work group participants? Thank you. And seeing no additional comments from... Nope. Yes.
I'm not bringing the issue back up again, but I just wanted to clarify what we did with the utility monitoring control J4. Are we going back to the original language, or are we striking it all together? In other words, are we rolling back our authority under number 4?
We are striking regulation J4 in its entirety.
Okay, so so we're getting rid of even what pre-existed before today's regulation.
This is slide 12 of the slide deck.
Not just going back to where we were.
Correct. It strikes existing 4 and proposed 4, regardless, either one in its entirety. That, at this time, I will make a motion. And the motion will be subject to the following revisions. Since all of today's revisions are in Title 20, Subtitle 50, Chapter 9, I will only refer to the 4th component, which is the regulation. And we have 7 revisions. The first one is that we are striking 6J4 in its entirety. We're striking the entirety of 6O. 6Q will be modified as proposed by the PHI utilities. 12D will be retained. 12E3E will be retained. 12F1 and 12F2 will be modified as discussed by Chief Borkowski. And finally, 14A8 will be modified by replacing the words peak interconnection with the term nameplate. Therefore, move to publish in the Maryland Register for notice and comment the revisions to COMAR Title 20, Subtitle 50, Chapter 9, filed by the Commission's technical staff in this docket on July 22nd, 2019, as amended in my comments from a moment ago, and in today's rulemaking session, subject to non-substantive changes necessary to conform to COMAR drafting requirements. All in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? The motion is approved, noting the dissent of Commissioners Richard and O'Donnell with respect to regulation 6J4.
Commissioner Linton and Richard.
I'm sorry, did I say O'Donnell? I meant Commissioner Linton and Commissioner Richard for the record.
Sorry, I've been confused with Commissioner O'Donnell before.
Separated at birth. Thank you. This concludes today's hearing in RM68.